Wesley, we're now in Milltown Cemetery, not far from Belfast City Cemetery, and this is the reserved ground where unidentified or unclaimed bodies were buried after both the April air raids and the May air raids. Unfortunately, whilst in Belfast City Cemetery there are burial registers which give details of the numbers and names of some of the burials, we don't have that information for Milltown Cemetery because this plot was owned by the Civil Defence Services, and so the details of the bodies buried here was not recorded in any registers. So we don't know how many people are buried in this plot, but my estimate would be between 50 and 60 fatalities. We do know the names of at least 3 fatalities that are buried in here. Because they were military, and there's a memorial headstone that records their names and dates of death, and we'll visit that headstone shortly. But again, we've got a situation where unidentified people, and how did they pick who was to be buried here? When any unidentified bodies that had symbols or some sort of means of identifying as being Roman Catholics. For example, if the body was wearing a crucifix or a pilgrim's medal or something like that, if they could be clearly identified as being Roman Catholics, they were buried here. Any that couldn't would be buried in the reserved ground at City Cemetery. So the reserved ground at City Cemetery contains a mixture of Protestants and Catholics who were unidentified, whereas this plot just contains the remains of Roman Catholics whose bodies were not identified. This section in Milltown Cemetery contains probably the highest proportion of private burials of Blitz fatalities. There's a mixture of military and civilian fatalities buried in this section. This grave here beside me contains the remains of Christopher and Sarah Grimes from Vere Street. Christopher was a veteran of the Boer War and the First World War. He and his wife died in the same incident when their house was destroyed. Sarah Grimes's body was never recovered, and she is commemorated on the headstone, whereas Christopher Grimes is actually buried in the grave. The headstone next to it is a Commonwealth War Graves headstone, and it commemorates William Henry McGennity of 70th Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles, who died at his home in Ardoyne along with his wife and 2 children. William McGennity and his daughter Margaret are buried in the plot, and both their names are recorded on the Commonwealth War Graves headstone, but his wife and his son, their bodies were either never recovered or could not be identified, and they have no known graves. The third headstone in this particular section, this block, is another couple of Blitz fatalities. Mary Ann Core died 16th April 1941. Her dear son Frederick Core also died 16th April 1941, aged 11 years, both killed in the Belfast Blitz. And that's one of the ways you can identify Blitz fatalities buried in family plots. There will sometimes be an inscription that will say something like, killed by enemy action, killed in German air raids, or killed in the Belfast Blitz. This Celtic cross in Milltown Cemetery commemorates 2 of the fatalities from Sussex Street. The inscription reads, erected by Thomas Flood in loving memory of his son Thomas, and aged 20 years, and Francis McKenna, aged 18 years, who were killed 16th April 1941. These were a young couple, possibly engaged to be married, who died at Francis McKenna's house in Sussex Street during the German air raid. This row of headstones in Milltown Cemetery is where several army fatalities of the Second World War are buried. There's also 7 graves of Polish airmen who died in the Second World War and are buried here. But this end headstone commemorates 3 members of the Pioneer Corps who died on 5th May 1941. They're not buried here, they're commemorated here, and the inscription at the top says, "Buried in Section B, Row FG, Grave 45. And that grave is in the reserved ground that we've looked at earlier on. The 3 men were Private James Valentine Osborne from Dagenham, who was 27 years old, Corporal Thomas Keane, who was born in County Clare, but living in London when he enlisted, was 26 years old. Private James Simon Moore from Keady in County Armagh was 25 years old.